Please welcome to the stage Dr. Stephen Novella, Bob Novella, Jay Novella, author of Skeptics Guide to the Future. Moderated by Lawrence Jones, Senior Vice President for International Programs of Edison Electric Institute, United States.
Good afternoon and welcome to this closing session of EEI's 7 Global Electrification Forum. Our closing session is a conversation with the authors of the Skeptics Guide to the Future, Stephen Novella, Bob Novella, and Jay Novella. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you
for
having us here.
Well, first of all, I have never had the privilege to interview 3 brothers. And I've definitely not had the privilege to interview 3 brothers who've written 1 book. So let's begin by each of you just telling us briefly about yourself. We'll start first with you, Stephen. Go ahead.
So by profession, I'm an academic neurologist, but alongside that, basically for the last 30, 40 years, I've also been a science communicator, a professional skeptic, if there is such a thing, and author now of 2 books, a couple of blogs. We've been producing a podcast for the last 18 years, Skeptics Guide to the Universe, where the books derive from.
Okay. Go ahead, Jay.
So I am the COO of our company, which we started to run our podcast. We started the podcast, like Steve said, about 18 years ago. I basically work as a producer. I do all the tech work, and I run all the shows that we do. And we have, at this point, we've developed quite a number of different shows that we do. So we have our podcast, we have a science fiction review show, we have a game show, we write books. We do a stage show. We just keep coming up with stuff to do. So whatever we think is fun, we do it.
Okay. Bob.
I'm in IT. I work with computers during the day, but like these guys, of course, I consider myself a science communicator, co-host the Skeptics Guide to the Universe podcast, and also the Alpha Quadrant 6 science fiction podcast. Done some blogging for the show as well. And I also run a haunted house.
Okay. So when I told my team we're inviting you guys for the closing session, their first reaction was looking at the title of the book, The Skeptics Guide to the Future. And we've had 5 days of discussion here at the Global Electrification Forum, addressing things from the energy transition, climate change, how to deal with affordability, universal access to electricity. And I'm sure the viewing audience is asking themselves the same question. Lawrence, why did you invite these 3 guys to have this conversation to end the Jeff? But you guys are not skeptics, even though the book says The Skeptics Guide to the Future. So maybe, Steve, just walk us through the whole idea of skepticism and how the book came about.
Yeah, so we know that the term skeptic has some marketing issues, but when we chose it, again, 30 plus years ago, it's really scientific skepticism in the model of, the great science communicators, Carl Sagan. And what it means basically is we take a scientific approach to figuring out what's real and what's not real, right? And sort of the modern skeptical movement, I think has 3 main pillars. It's trying to promote scientific literacy, critical thinking skills, and media savvy. You have to understand how to access information and how to tell what's real and what's not real. Now, of course, the term has been used by other groups, including people that we would consider to be science deniers, but they really are abusing that term.
Like the moon landing skeptics.
Yeah, or climate change deniers. And we're anti that sort of thing, right? We're very much not, science denying skeptics.
So I've read the books, and I know you're not. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here.
Right.
But let's get into just going back to your upbringing, right? So 3 brothers into sci-fi. Tell me about your upbringing. Maybe let's start with you, Bob. How was it growing up with these 2 guys and into sci-fi?
It was great. I talked to my friends, and they're like, "Oh yeah, my brothers and I, we used to punch each other in the head every day." And we never had any type of fights like that. We got along so well. But my earliest memories of sci-fi is my dad showing us Star Trek when we were maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. We were watching Star Trek, and he would bring us to sci-fi movies. And so that, I think he is the first one to instill the love of sci-fi into us. And that just we've never let go to this day. I mean, we're doing a sci-fi podcast, AQ6. I mean, we love it. We see movies, we talk about it. So I give it to my dad for that. Right? So your memory as well, guys.
Definitely, yeah.
So Jay, how was it at home? I mean, with Bob and Steve, talk about the sort of the sci-fi debate you must have had as brothers.
Yeah. So the funny thing about our podcast is it's really the way that our family talks. Like that's the vibe of our podcast. It's a common space where people can talk to each other very openly. We heavily debate and talk about science fiction all the time, but as we grew older, we got into science, and then science became really the topics that we loved to discuss. And when we started the podcast 18 years ago, it was like a no-brainer. Like, yeah, we're just going to get into a forum and we're going to talk about this topic that we really love, because mostly what we talk about on our podcast is current science.
Actually, what fascinated me about the book when I got it first and I read it was the subtitle, which is what yesterday's science and science fiction tells us about the world of tomorrow. And that's why I wanted you guys to be the closing act and the Jeff, because the conversation we've been having was about 2030, 2050. We have all of these targets about where the world is going, universal access, 8 billion people, which is what you talk about in the book. So we'll get into some of that. Let's go back to chapter 1 in the book, where you begin with a very interesting sort of a proposition where you say the future begins with the past, and then you characterize the future and the prediction of the future as some sort of a wild fantasy that is sort of a design or defined by our hopes, our imagination, our fears. Talk about that in terms of, as we now look to 2030, 2050, how should we be thinking about that future, but remembering the past? Maybe we'll start with you, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is that when we speculate about the future, it really says more about us now than the actual future. Because, the future is going to be crafted bit by decisions that people make, including future people that are not us. And so it's always very hard to, again, extrapolate all of those decisions. So we're really just projecting our current biases, our current beliefs, our current thinking onto the future. And the future is very good at destroying that conceit very, very quickly. It's very hard to predict the future because it's not about just, us today. We often project ourselves into the future. Like we will be the people in 2050 who, and that's even fairly close, but no, there'll be a new generation of people who are going to be living life and making decisions and interfacing with technology. And so we have to think about that as well. How is everything else going to change? The other sort of thing that, we talk about these, futurism fallacies as we're imagining the future, is that we think of one technology at a time. So we may be thinking, what's our energy infrastructure going to be like in 2050? And we're thinking just about energy infrastructure. It's yeah, but you also have to be thinking about every single other technology, which is also advancing over the next 30 years. And that's going to be changing the game in unpredictable ways. So those are just some of the challenges we face. And why, again, we're just projecting our biases into the future when we try to make predictions.
Want to add anything, Bob?
Yeah, it's like when you see some predictions from the 50s or the 30s, and you see people that are obviously from the 50s or the 30s. They have the fashions might be very old-fashioned, but they're using a video phone. They're using this. They think of one really interesting bit of tech from the future, but everything else is the same. They are basically the same people, but with new technology. They're not really taking enough of the past into the future. And like Steve said, it's really a projection of themselves. They carry all of their biases and things that they take for granted, and they carry that into the future. So yeah, it is a great window into what they're all about and not what the future is about.
So Jay, let's talk a little bit about sci-fi in the future, because it's fascinating, the examples you guys use in the book when you talk about sci-fi. We'll get into some of that. But coming back to this whole point about taking our sort of our current biases, if you may, and having to drive us into the future. Talk about the difficulty when you're watching a sci-fi movie and you try to put yourself in that future, but you just can't do it because you mentally cannot imagine yourself being in that sci-fi future. How does one deal with that?
Well, that's a great question. And first of all, a good story is about people. So regardless of what science fiction movie you're watching, there has to be that kernel of, these are people and they have a problem and they're trying to solve it or whatever. You could pick any sci-fi movie. If it's good, the characters are good and we can relate to them. not being able to relate to the technology and all that. I think it's the role of the writers and the director. They have to create a believable universe that's true to itself. You can't break your own rules, which happens all the time. There's so many times when we're watching a sci-fi movie, and at the same exact time, all three of us are like, what did they just do? Because they make a bad decision that doesn't jive with the universe that they've created. So that, that's one thing that we love to talk about. We'll rip that movie apart and come up, with everything that we can think of, that mistakes that they made. And then we'll also talk about the great things. We love the visions of the future. We love to see people's, what their predictions are. I mean, that's real science fiction, is them making predictions on what they think the future will be. Like robots, for example, they come up. Humans have a love affair with robots. We've been making up stories about them since Greek mythology. Like robots are, a part of the human condition, I think. And if you go through the history of robots and you see how robots have changed and all the different ways that people have envisioned robots, that's a great way to look at futurism in general. If you just take a look at how people have, what do we want robots to do in the 50s? What do we want them to do in the 60s? Like that changes as the years go by.
Yeah. So look, we will, before we move on and get into some of the fallacies about science fiction and the predictions that people have made, I just want you all to tell the audience, each of you, let's see if you can't say what your brother has said, so you have to come up with your own idea. Oh. So what's your favorite science fiction movie? Starting with Jay.
Star Wars, the first one.
Okay.
Star Wars number 4.
Fourth one. But
Star Wars number 4, which is the very first one.
Number 4, which is the first one. Then the follow-up question for that, why was that, or is that your favorite Star Wars science fiction movie?
Well, I mean, I think I was 8 or 9 when it came out, so I was in the perfect age to understand the movie and really appreciate what I was seeing. And it took me on a journey that has lasted my whole life, right? It's just always been with me, because there was a magic element in that movie at that age. I just feel like that movie, Lucas, used Joseph Campbell's idea of the heroic journey and all that. There's something very human about the core of that movie. So it just rang a chord. I just don't think any other movie could touch it, because I was a child when it happened. So any movie I see as an adult, like, it just won't even come near that movie.
Oh,
I can't pick Star Wars. All right, I'll pick. It's an impossible question. I'll pick one of the movies that are my favorites, and that's, say, Terminator. The Terminator series. Fell in love with it. I remember to this day. This is 84. After the movie, I remember like being so enthusiastic and talking about it.
Yeah, Terminator, right? It's another robot.
Right, and then is your next question then why does
why is it? Yeah,
well, I love robots.
Yeah,
I mean, I collect robots. I've got like 100. I've got 100 robots in my collection. I've been obsessed with them since I was a little kid. So I always love them. Time travel. Who doesn't love time travel? And that movie is a very good example of a time travel movie, which isn't easy to do. Arnold Schwarzenegger, I loved Arnold Schwarzenegger ever since he came to America and won Mr. Universe. I loved him. So it was kind of like a perfect storm of awesomeness for that movie.
Okay. All right, you, Steve?
I have the correct answer, of course, which is 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Here we go.
To me, that's the quintessential science fiction movie. I like it for a number of reasons. It's not that far in the future, so
it got totally wrong.
It's not. Well, of course they did, but it's not so, fantasy speculative. And it's looking at like what space travel going to be like in the near future. They introduce ideas of artificial intelligence. They actually try to get some of the physics correct in a way that most science fiction movies don't do. And just, of course, it's Stanley Kubrick and wonderful storytelling. So all the elements were there.
So do you guys think, and I'm sure you will say yes because you're sci-fi fanatics, maybe I should call you, but would you say that every company, every organization should at least hire one sci-fi expert? And I'm asking the question because of imagination. Because I think one of the things you see in sci-fi movies is that you like, when you watch them, like, how could they imagine this, right? It's always the imagination that fascinates you, right? And as we talk about the energy transition, we talk about the future of the world, all these big issues we're facing, do we need more sci-fi thinkers in corporate organizations?
I mean, I think I would say it slightly differently. I would say futurists which there's a huge overlap with science fiction authors. I mean, science fiction authors also have to be great storytellers, which again, like,
and that's why actually I was going to go, but I want to Jay, the storytelling piece.
Storytelling
right?
piece of it, I think, is important for a good sci-fi, but it's not necessarily going to be helpful necessarily to a corporation in terms of imagining the future. But good science fiction writers have to be good futurists. Almost always, depending on exactly what they're writing about. And sometimes they're accidental futurists. They're not really trying to be, but they sort of are forced to be for their story. But some of them are very conscientiously futurists, like Isaac Asimov, I think, is a great example. Sometimes they build the story around their futurists, and they have a great idea, like Altered Carbon, a recent book, and then the series and science fiction series, is really built around this idea. Well, what if we divorce our minds from our bodies, and we become a computer stack and we just wear bodies like sleeves, like putting on a new jacket. That's the idea of the whole series. It's sort of built around this thought experiment about extrapolating digital and brain-machine interface technology into the future. That kind of futurism where, in science fiction, just a play box, just a way of just doing all these thought experiments, both good and bad. Like, is it going to destroy the world? Is it going to, is it going to save the world? What's going to happen? I think is really, really useful. And of course, there's been a lot of climate change, futurism happening on TV now, and so that's, I think, also very useful.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about some of the fallacies, and I think the audience, both watching and in the room here, will find it interesting because. And there are 10 of them, so we're not going to go through all of them. I picked a few, maybe, or I picked 3. The first one, let me get to my fallacies here, because I was intrigued, and the audience might be so when we find out who we're wrong in terms of predicting, right? We have some of them still alive today who said certain things about technology and got it wrong. I'm going to go to number 10, which was the fallacy is failing to consider how technology will affect people, our option, and the choices we make. And I bring that up because we're at a critical time for the energy industry. We're making a lot of, predictions on what we're going to use, what's going to be the energy source of the future. And there's one very well-famous person who made a prediction. You mentioned him, and regarding technology and computers. So why don't you talk about his fallacy about what was going to happen regarding computers? You know what I'm talking about, right?
Well, we make a few in there. You're talking about Asimov?
No, not Asimov.
Is that Bill Gates?
It's Bill Gates, yeah. Because I thought that was intriguing how you guys wrote about Bill Gates in the book. So go ahead and talk about that. Who wants to do it?
Well, Bill Gates made such a flaw. When he made it, I actually knew he was wrong, which blows my mind. Yeah, well, he didn't include an internet browser in one version of Windows when he released it, right?
Yeah, but the specific one, he said like some ridiculously small amount of.
There would
be more than enough for anybody, and so. That's, I think, an iconic example, because he was saying, yes, for how computers are being used right now, this amount of memory is more than enough. Why would we ever need more? And what he failed to consider was the iterative process that was going to happen. It's like, but when you make computers more powerful, people start using them in different ways, which then requires more power, which then allows them to use them in other ways still. And he did not anticipate that things like video games were actually going to drive computer hardware more than anything else. That wasn't in his projection. Yeah. You're thinking of computers as spreadsheets or whatever, he was thinking of it as.
Business application.
And then that was obviously also pre-internet. Yeah. So there is this, back and forth between the technology and how people are using the technology, which then influences the technology, which then influences how people use the technology.
But it's a great example, though, of a forward-thinking person running a multi-billion-dollar forward-thinking company, missed that.
Yeah, it just had these.
It just doesn't seem to make any sense that you couldn't see that.
But let's bring one thing up now, since we're going to go down that route with a forward-thinking person. ChatGPT just came out.
Yeah. Right.
So tell us about how could the whole industry miss it?
So we were talking a little while ago about the fact that Google was blown away when ChatGPT 3.5 came out. OpenAI comes out with their product. Hey, we want the whole world to test this. And it really caught Google with their pants down, and now they're scrambling to catch up.
Yeah,
because their technology isn't there. It's 20% behind where OpenAI is, and that's a big problem. But we missed it. The whole world didn't see it coming. Industry people missed it. right? Even Google missed it. They didn't realize where that other company was.
But I think, we knew that something like this was coming. It's the details that are difficult. Like, we didn't know exactly where different AI platforms were going to be and when. This is definitely came up quicker than I thought thought it was going to.
We were all shocked when it came out. When I first used it,
it was like a leap that we knew.
Yeah, my reaction was like, I can't believe that this was simmering in the background and the public didn't know about it.
But guys, if you remember, I talked about ChatGPT first on the show about a year ago.
Yeah.
It came up, and then I read the news item. I talked about it on the show. I talked how it can create very realistic text, and the flow was beautifully human. It really sounded like somebody was doing that, and it was just a predictor. It just predicted the next word with probabilities and stuff. And even then, I didn't really anticipate what was to come in the next 7, 8, 9 months. But you really can't blame them that much, because by its very nature, this is like an emergent phenomenon. As you increase the scale and the complexity, these new abilities arise that it's inherently unpredictable in a lot of ways. So that, it was hard to see this happening.
Not only did this happen quicker, I think, than a lot of people thought it was going to happen. Now we're making the opposite problem. Now we're in the overhyping phase. People think, oh, this is going to change everything. It's like, well, slow down a little bit.
Or even now, they say it's already artificial intelligence.
It's already
general intelligence. Not
forget about the claims that it's sentient. They're completely wrong. But so now these companies are rushing to get applications out with AI in them, and that's really premature. It's going to take us years to sort out what is it good at, what is it not good at, what is it really going to do. And so that's another fallacy we talk about, where people tend to underestimate this long-term progress, but they overestimate short-term progress.
Good segue. That's fallacy number one. I want to tend to come back to one for a very special reason, and you just what I meant for you to do, because fallacy number one is overestimating short-term progress and underestimating long-term progress. Right?
Right.
So talk about that.
Well, short-term is as we've really recognized we talk about it on the show, short-term progress is slow and incremental. It's little pieces over time. People like me in the past, I would expect more dramatic leaps. But in the main, though, it's really just small and incremental, and it's frustrating because they're just tiny little changes. But over 10, 20, 30 years, even a lot of incremental changes, there's enough of them where it becomes dramatic. And
it's more geometric than linear. People are biased into thinking linear. And so, but reality is more often it's not linear. It's everything, but there's a lot of non-linear phenomena happening. But that works both ways, because not only is our progress non-linear, geometric sometimes, but the problems themselves are non-linear in terms of their difficulties. So that's where people overestimate the short-term progress too.
Yeah.
Like, remember in the 80s when we had the high temperature superconductors, and pretty much the vibe was any day now we're going to have room temperature superconductors. And here we are 30, 40 years later, and we're really no closer to having, a wire that is a superconductor in ambient pressures. And
Steve, look at autonomous cars. Like we all thought that we would be in cars that are driving themselves overhyped, but they never could get to stage 4 and stage 5 in the ability for the cars to drive safely.
But that last 5% takes most of the effort.
Right.
But that's why I wanted us to have this conversation. I'm so excited sitting here, because you're doing exactly what I thought you would do. Raise the concerns many have about how we go about transitioning the energy system.
Yeah.
Because we have to do it in a way that is not going to create hardships for many. Right. We want it to be affordable, reliable, resilient. And that means you have to sort of really understand these technological trends and the nonlinearity that exists within them. So this is great. Let's go ahead.
I'll just add, and being flexible, because again, we're old enough to remember the coming hydrogen economy, right? In the 2000s, when they underestimated how difficult storage was going to be, and so here we are again 20 years later, and they still haven't cracked that problem that they said was right around the corner 20 years ago, and they also failed to consider competing technology. Yeah. So in the interim, while you're failing to figure out the core problem of like driving around in a car storing lots of hydrogen safely, battery technology just continually progressed in the background and completely blew away a hydrogen fuel cell car kind of concept.
Jay, there's another fallacy I want to come to, fallacy number 6, and I think it's more in line with your part of the trio here, because it says placing current people and culture into the future Very interesting. When we design technology, what do we do wrong when it comes to where we place people?
I think it's a bottomless pit of questions. You know, we don't know what people are going to be like in the future. I mean, look at how much our society has changed just in the last 10 years. So, you know, we were saying we're going to develop, you know, technology for people in the future. I think what's happening is people are developing technology. You know, companies are investing in technologies that they think, you know, a year or two down the road, you know, could make money or it could be beneficial. I don't think we can really make technology for people beyond that. I just think it stumbles along. Companies come up with the technology that they do, and they make decisions on what they're going to invest billions of dollars into to develop. And sometimes they get it right, and sometimes there's a big payoff. And the people aspect of it, you know, how much could you really factor it in? We have no idea. I didn't know who I was going to be 10 years ago. I just don't think we can predict that.
Think about this. You know, our children have a completely different relationship with technology than we do.
Yeah.
We couldn't really predict it one generation away. And even when we know that they have a different relationship with it, we still have a hard time wrapping our heads around it. I mean, our kids grew up living in a social media fishbowl. They're just different people than we were. We could never get to that kind of relationship.
Lawrence, do you remember when texting was like, I'm never going to text? Texting was not popular.
We were supposed to all be using video phones.
Yeah, we thought we would be using video phones, and now texting is probably the primary form of communication that most of us use.
So this raises a very interesting societal question, because you then have what I call mixed demographics, right? You have those who thought they would never text, and those who are texting, those who are on Facebook, those who would never get on Facebook. So how does society converge when you have 5 generations who have a completely different set of future outlook, but even current sort of a means of existence? How do we do that?
It's a great question. I don't know that we have an answer to that, and it won't necessarily.
I told my team I had ran out of questions for the day, for the week.
but I think you got to follow the money. Companies are going to, if there is a way to make money off of boomers, they'll do it. And there is plenty of ways to make money with technology off of people in that generation.
Cater to their concerns.
Yeah, I mean, so there's multiple categories that technology can fall in depending on the age range. I really don't think that companies could say, we know that this is going to work. And they have to bet their money and their energy and time. You know, like a pharmaceutical company developing a new drug, they don't know what the end result is going to be. They pick the one that they think fits the slot best, and they go for it.
Right. This gets to the inherent inability to sort of predict the future, because, you know, you're trying to imagine the collective decisions by 8 billion people, and you can't do that. All you could do is just keep throwing stuff against the wall and see what sticks. And so we sort of learn as people make choices and interact with technology. Like the segways, again, an example from the book. It was supposed to transform the way people get around cities, and you know, because the technology works, you know, it is cool technology. But, you know, people just felt dorky riding those things, and that was enough to pretty much kill it. It was also an infrastructure problem, and people always fail to forget infrastructure. It doesn't matter if the technology works. If the infrastructure wasn't there, it's not going to be incorporated. They were assuming that infrastructure would build itself around, can reconfigure itself around this technology. That's a tough sell.
This is so fascinating, because one of the topics at the Jeff this week was around infrastructure. It was around building infrastructure, permitting and siting. So as we talk about the energy transition, right, we need the infrastructure to be built. What you were alluding to, Steve, is actually fallacy number 7, which I had selected and you brought it up. Because it was one of the 4 that I took, because that's interesting. Everything that happens in the future will be planned and deliberate. Yeah, that's what we think.
Right, that's the fallacy.
That's the fallacy.
It will be planned. Yeah. And if you read past futurists, they always say this will happen because people will engineer it specifically to happen this way for this specific reason, because they're optimizing convenience. Again, they're projecting their priorities onto the future and saying that we will engineer my priorities into the future. And of course, that's not what happened. You know, everything else happened. You know, lots of things happened. The future isn't going to be just one thing. When you ask, like, what will happen or how will people use technology? Well, it'll be everything what's going to happen. It's really just a matter of proportion and which ones are going to dominate. And it's not planned. It's going to be different than whatever you think it is. You know, like we talk about one of the most disruptive technologies in our lifetimes is the smartphone. You know, you talk about it, we still call it a phone. which is probably the least used function of this device, which again, it incorporates so many things that we just talked about. Like you can't anticipate how this other functionality may become dominant, and then that changes the technology. And now technology is moving in the direction of this new way of using the technology, even though it emerged for this other specific purpose. I can't even get my daughters to answer a phone. Like the idea that a smartphone is an actual phone is like so secondary to them. They don't use it as a phone at all.
What should we call it?
A smart device, I guess, or whatever. But
who would have thought that most of us would be doing most of our shopping on one website?
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So these. I mean, this is very interesting because, again, you all are raising some very pertinent issues here, specifically as we talk about the energy transition, because energy is so fundamental.
Right.
And when people talk about disruption, what they don't realize is not just the technology, it's what will people do with the technology. Mm-hmm. So you can want people to do certain things in terms of, fallacy number 7, where you sort of you can plan the future, but you really can't, right?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that we talk about, like we think about, like, will cars as a service become a thing? Will people like it? I don't know. We'll have to see. People may love it. People may hate it, and that will determine whether or not.
Unknowable.
It's kind of
absolutely unpredictable.
What we do know is we do need to revamp the grid. Like, we know that that's coming, and we know that companies and the government have to get on board, and that's not happening. I think that's a no-brainer.
Yeah. So I think we'll get into the technology because you guys lay out 3 different sets of technology, the ones we have today, the ones that are coming, and the ones that probably crazy future.
Yeah.
We'll get to that. But so one of the things that drive a lot of change in society is public policy, right? And obviously that's an important part. Just help us to understand from your perspective, how could these ideas around futurism and some of the things we've talked about, perhaps jokingly when it comes to some of the technological mistakes, but what should policymakers listening to this conversation glean in terms of how can we apply futurism and maybe be realistic about some of the fallacies when we design public policy?
Yeah, I think being humble, right, is probably the most important thing.
Supporting general scientific research, general research, invest a lot of money. I think, I don't know what the figure is, but for every $1 that's invested in general science, I think the payback is it's insane.
Magnitude,
and don't pick a horse, right?
Don't pick
with the hydrogen economy. People were saying, the government should invest in the hydrogen economy.
Arnold Schwarzenegger, who you love, is the governor, right, of California, said, we're going to build the hydrogen infrastructure in California, and then people will come. It's like, build it and they will come. Mm-hmm. That is sort of true. It turned out not to be true in that case, so it's not always true. So, we do have to be projecting a little bit into the future. Like, we have to decide where we're going, because again, sometimes infrastructure makes technology possible. You can argue, and a lot of people have argued, that we could be driving electric cars right now if the sequence of events was just a little bit different 100 years ago.
100 years ago.
If the electrical grid, was maybe 10 or 20 years earlier, and the discovery of crude oil was maybe 10 or 20 years later, we might all be driving electric cars now to begin with, right? That's all infrastructure. It's not the technology at all. Mm-hmm. And now we're trying to imagine, right, for the next century, what infrastructure choices are we going to make that will guide, how technology gets used. And we're also trying to top down it a lot, because we're saying the market may lead in this direction, but we don't want it to go in that direction. We want it to go into this other direction because we don't want to destroy the climate, of our own planet. So we're going to force it, to go in the direction we want it to go in. And we may have no choice because here we are, we don't have that much time, but that's really hard to do.
It's hard to do.
It's very,
Picking, like, say, fusion power. Mm-hmm. It seems like, we're just waiting for our fusion reactors, right? And they've had some major successes in the past decade with that. Yeah. But we're not even sure now, how much of a player, fusion reactors are going to be in energy production. Solar and wind may be so much cheaper that there really isn't a place for a huge fusion footprint. Although I think fusion will have applications in other things, plenty of other things, like spaceships, for example, is one. But so it's so hard. You just got to try to lay the groundwork and let it almost decide itself, right? Don't try to predict what people are going to do.
My bottom line would be, you have to invest in the things that make the most sense, but hedge your bets, man. Hedge your bets.
So let's talk about hedging the bets, right? So Jay, I want to come back as a storyteller. Well, you all are storytellers, but since you're the one running the podcast, I guess. How do we talk about what Bob mentioned? We want to have electric vehicles and all these technological things, but with them also come the need for critical minerals. So how do we balance the interdependencies of these choices we make? It's not just having this. To have this, I must have that. And sometimes we forget about the that, right? So you want wind, you want EVs, but you also need critical minerals, right? You need it to come from, say, Africa or other parts of the world, right? How do we balance those interdependencies when we start to pick windows or we try to project? Are we projecting one thing but forgetting about the other thing? So we want this, we project to have 5 billion EVs, I'm just making this up. But we don't think about where are we going to get the critical minerals from. So we make one line of projection because that's something we want, maybe. It's based on our experience, right? The current sense. But we forget that, by the way, we're going to need critical minerals. Yeah. So how do we do this sort of a simultaneous projection, if you may?
I think right now we're in a tipping point. I feel like governments are betting on the come. Like, oh, we'll somehow get the stuff that we need. That's a dangerous position to put yourselves in. And on top of that, like, again, we don't have the infrastructure to handle all the new batteries that are going to be coming onto the grid. I don't hear conversations happening where they're talking about the next 5 years of what needs to be done or what, the idea that we don't actually know if there's enough minerals on this planet to handle the battery requirements of the 2050s. What are we going to do? Like we need to invest in companies like, what was that company, Steve, that doubled the capacity?
Amprius, yeah.
Yeah, like this company Amprius, we just interviewed the CEO of that company, and they made a minor change to their battery and they doubled its capacity. And they're using less rare earth minerals.
Well, that's the next generation.
Yeah, the next gen.
But they're predicting that.
If they fix this one material problem, then we don't need the cobalt. And then you also have the sodium batteries, which are not as dense, but they're cheaper and they don't use the cobalt. So the thing is, these complex webs evolve over time, and they take a lot of time for things to slide into place. And if you force it, then you and by fiat rather than letting it naturally evolve, then you run the risk of collapse. So there's a good historical lesson I have to bring up, because it was amazing to me when I first learned this. The transition from bronze to iron was not because of any inherent superiority of iron over bronze. It was because bronze required two minerals, right? It's copper and tin. And the bronze economy, the bronze civilization collapsed because they couldn't maintain the supply lines of these two metals. And iron's one metal, and it was easier, and so that predominated. Then steel, once steel technology took over, then it was a no-brainer. But
plus, iron kills vampires, and that's very useful.
True. That's hugely advantageous. So that was just two metals that collapsed the civilization because they couldn't maintain those long trade routes and bring them all together. And think about the complex web that we have built in our modern society.
Scary.
It is scary. It's very brittle. It's very fragile in a way.
The pandemic revealed minor disruptions. I mean, we were literally fighting over toilet paper. That happened in the United States. Like, it's mind-blowing because of
fighting over toilet paper.
Yeah, it's true. It can happen. So it's very if those minerals don't somehow come from somewhere, we aren't going to make batteries.
Yeah. So there's got to be a lot of investment, but man, you got to stay nimble. You got to stay nimble, and because if you lock yourself in, that's where I get scared.
We talked on the show about mining the ocean. There's like some minerals that we may think is scarce now. We said, well, with certain technologies that are coming up, we can mine the ocean and we could have enough of this mineral for like 1,000 years.
No, there's enough lithium in the oceans to provide our current use for 1 million years. Yeah. So, but what's the technology of getting it out? What are the downsides? What's it going to cost? It always comes down to cost, right? Yeah. So they're there. Just a matter of how it all shakes out. But again, that just takes time. It's got to shake out. Just making it happen is very tricky.
If you identify that such a bottleneck, then you start looking into the backups, and so you're ready to hit the ground running.
Backups
for worst case scenarios that could take down your society.
That's why I like what you said, Bob. Like world governments need to invest in their people with education. We need more engineers. We want female engineers. You know what I mean? We want more people involved in science, because the more people that are there, the more answers we'll get.
It's interesting. So before we get into some of the technology, because you guys wrote some very interesting technology, I wasn't aware of some of them. I just want to come back to people who got things wrong in terms of their prediction. And I want to come to our own venerable Thomas Edison. Tell us about his prediction about phonograph, which he got wrong, right?
Yeah, so I can't remember off the top of my head now with that specific prediction.
Well, as he said, it wasn't going to be. It was
generally useful.
Yeah, he said it wouldn't be generally useful.
Yeah. Right. So that's a lack of imagination for how a technology might be used.
From
the person who invented
Thomas Edison, the guy who invented the light bulb.
There's always these two pieces of like the technology itself and how the technology gets used. And sometimes you have like the desire to do something, but you don't have the technology to make it happen, like hydrogen or whatever. And sometimes you have a technology looking for an application. That's like, again, like the Segway, for example. And like you can do it, but we don't do things just because we can do things. A lot of, again, futurism fallacy. People think we're going to do it this way in the future because we can't, because we'll have the technology to do it that way. So no, we won't do it just because we can't. People will make decisions based upon a lot of things about their life. And so this is similar to, the computer prediction problems. Like 1 billion people, 8 billion people have more imagination than you do. People will figure out a way to use the technology if there is some utility there. And you kind of just have to put it out there and see what happens. So that's why you're making a prediction. Again, you're just saying what, again, your own biases are, your own life is, but we underestimate how many freaking people there are in the world. There's 8 billion people in the world. That's a lot of different experiences, different priorities, and you can't incorporate that all into one person's imagination.
Look at the electron. When the electron was discovered, it was just, you'd think that'd be a pretty big discovery, but they had no clue what we would do with the lowly electron, and they were making fun of it. One guy famously toasted the electron after it was discovered. It's like, may it come to nothing ever.
It come to nothing ever.
He didn't anticipate it ever being useful for anything other than a footnote.
The ancients had
imagine this society without taking advantage of the electron.
Yeah. Isn't it also a little risky from an investment standpoint? Because oftentimes those giants who make those predictions, they shape the markets, right? So when Edison said what he said, I'm sure it had an impact on the phonograph, and probably when Gates said his thing, it did at the time. So how should society sort of temper our sort of hubris, if you may, when it comes to hearing one big famous person say, we shall do this, and everybody invests in that, right? How should we, guard ourselves against jumping quickly based on what some famous person is saying, especially when we want to transition something as complex as the energy system?
Yeah, we call it the argument from authority, right? Which is relying on one person's authority. This is a big industry leader, so he must know what he's talking about, or she must know what he's talking about. Really, as much as possible, if you could rely more on the consensus of as many opinions as possible, you're much more likely to have a better and more accurate vision of the future, or whatever it is, whatever you're trying to wrap your head around.
Being scientifically literate absolutely helps. And more people that were scientifically literate, I think, would be easier, better, more likely to end the way you want it to end. If you
I would say
actually know some science.
Just because somebody's a billionaire doesn't actually mean they're smart or they know what's coming. Right.
Most of them are just lucky, right?
Or they have wealthy dads.
There's a survivor bias. Means you look at the people who did well or the people who survived and say, what did they do? They must have done something right. It's like, yeah, but they also might have just got lucky. And you can't really reverse engineer their success because you have so many people placing so many bets of somebody wins the lottery, right? Of course somebody's going to win. Do you talk to lottery winners and say, what did you do to pick your numbers? How did you do it? We kind of intuitively know they just got lucky. And I think, we don't like to think that industry is that way because we lose a sense of control when we think that. But if you really look at the data, it is more luck than anything else. I'm not saying that people haven't made good bets or good choices. Of course they have. But we tend to underestimate the role of luck. And success does not necessarily mean that it was engineered. It could you can't. That doesn't mean that there wasn't an element of luck in it. So, like with science in general, your goal should always be to understand the consensus of expert opinion, not listen to one guru. If you think of technology or science as a guru, you're going to be led astray by whatever their biases are. And it's very unlikely for any one person to have the whole picture.
So like you said, Steve, you said, we have the world of 8 billion people and counting. India just passed 1.4 billion. China is there, Africa is there. So how do we, the theme of this, the theme was, energizing 8 billion people, right? So how do we sort of apply your thinking regarding futurism, if you may, to public policy? Because I think at the end of the day, what you're saying is that public policy should have a bit of a long-term perspective, but it should also be grounded in reality.
Yeah.
How do we do that? Maybe we can go first.
So we talk about the fact in the book that there's this sweet spot in the future, right? Like you can extrapolate a certain distance into the future, and then beyond that, it's like predicting the weather. It just becomes impossible beyond a certain point. And so that's, I think, where I do think policy should be aiming is when, like we know we're headed in a certain direction, it's pretty reliable. And so then we could make investments. But again, they also have to realize that they're both following and leading technology, right? So they're trying to follow the science and follow the technology as it develops and follow the markets and how people are using it, et cetera, and the needs of their people. But they're also creating and influencing the market by the choices they make about who to subsidize. Are we going to subsidize the fossil fuel industry? Are we going to subsidize, the solar industry, right? And by what infrastructure you build. If you build the infrastructure, it doesn't give you a guarantee, but at least it creates the possibility that this technology can thrive because now it has the infrastructure to thrive. And so what we always like to see is, again, make these humble, modest, but sometimes they need to be bold choices, hedge your bets, and build in a self-correcting mechanism, like science in general, right? Science is science because it's self-correcting. They don't just make a prediction and say, that's true now forever. It's like, this is true for now until we get new information. When new information comes in, we have to stay nimble enough to change because we know we can't predict.
So Jay, science, there's one science I want us to talk a little bit about, and I promise you we'll get into these three technology areas, but behavioral science, because it ties into the human factor, the people side of this, right? How do we factor that in when we're making these kinds of decisions? Because you just said that 8 billion people in the world, I have no idea how they're going to react. So when I'm designing public policy, how should I be predicting how consumers are going to behave? We had a case in Australia, for example, I think it was Australia, where you have rooftop solar, right? They expected one public response to the public policy. They got something completely different. We had the same thing in Europe. One public policy expectation, behavioral science, completely different. So does it mean that behavioral forecasting is much more difficult than technology forecasting?
Absolutely. I mean, trying to predict human behavior, again, like we go back to the cell phone, we didn't know how the world was going to react to that. I don't think that Steve Jobs really knew that this was going to be the biggest thing. Like everyone was going to have one of these in their pocket. That's unpredictable. I just don't see a way to really predict that. I think again, going back to what Steve said, we shouldn't focus on trying to unravel how the human mind works and what people are going to do in the future. I think we just need to provide people the things that they want and need and follow the the needs of the market. Beyond that, what could we do?
Focus groups.
You do the best you can, but then you got to have some kind of, maybe rather than betting huge, like Schwarzenegger did with hydrogen, maybe spread your bets out a little bit, see what works, and then go with what seems to be working, rather than trying to go 10 steps ahead.
That said, I like the idea of what NASA does. They've got programs where they do their basic research, but they also have these prizes. I think they're X prizes, where they will give researchers money based on a proposal that's a long shot, something that is not very likely, but it's grounded in good science. But if they actually succeeded, it would be not an incremental advance, but it would be a quantum leap. It would be a jump. And I like the idea of having some of your investments in the long shots that could really pay off. Like the first company or country that creates a first true artificial general intelligence will have such a such a lead over of any other company or country that it's a major. You will control.
R&D is probably the one big win-win in all of this, right?
Yeah.
Like R&D is that's just giving you new raw material to work with. You know, you can do what you can with the elements you have, but this is sort of changes the game for you.
So for those who haven't read the book, I must say there are 4 categories of technology in the book. The first one, the technology that exists today, the ones that don't exist yet, and the one that they call isn't even possible, right? So I'll just pick one and either you can talk about it. Talk about the brain-machine interface in terms of where we are now.
Yeah.
Whoever wants to do it only has 1 minute.
We have a neurologist right here.
So that's why you're the neuroscience. So go ahead.
Yeah. So
just a minute, Steve.
Just a minute. So this the ability for a brain to communicate to a computer and a computer to communicate to a brain already exists now. I think it's one of those technologies, again, where we're underestimating the long-term potential of it. You know, this really, we've done enough research now to know that theoretically it works, and there's no reason why we can't have a matrix-style sort of interaction where, you know, your brain will accept a digital virtual reality completely, because we construct our reality anyway. So it's actually really easy to just slip in digital information into the reality that our brains are constructing. Mm-hmm. So it could be rather seamless. So we can imagine how people will use that technology, but they'll probably be using it in ways that are even different than what we could imagine now. But what we can say is that is an incredibly powerful technology that, you know, is going to hit its stride sometime in the future and will absolutely transform society.
And by the way, so you all do cover, you know, machine learning, quantum computing, how to power the future. So I can leave that for the audience to buy the book and read it. But I want to get into the future technologies that don't exist yet. And one that I found very interesting, synthetic life. Jay.
Well, first off, I love the topic. I think we're going to have synthetic life. I mean, we are machines. So it's not beyond the realm of physics for humans to be able to create synthetic life. I think the real question is consciousness. Will we actually be able to create a consciousness, and how would we even know if something that humans made became conscious? I have this thing I keep telling these guys. I'm horrified by this idea that we create artificial intelligence, it becomes conscious, and we just create and destroy like as some guy in a lab is testing.
Copy and paste.
Yeah, we're just, you know, virtually at that point, we're killing sentience every time they run a test. I think we have to be very careful when we start getting into that, because that is a game changer. And there's ethics involved at that point.
And the other angle to synthetic life, when you said synthetic life, my first thought was biological synthetic life. We are creating organisms from like homemade genomes. We're creating the genome from scratch, trying to determine like what's the smallest possible genome you can create and create life as we know it. So it's another angle. And that, in terms of sentience or something that is kind of conscious, that's, I think, would be easier because it's biological. We know that biological life, we know it works. Whereas creating an artificial life from silicon is much more problematic, much more difficult and complex, I think, because it's so foreign to us.
I would like us to take care of the biology that we have today, right? Let's take care of us, people that are already here. There's a lot of suffering. Like, we don't need to create new entities.
We'll make artificial bacteria,
so
artificial yeast.
Yeah,
to
create. That's great, and we could use them. They're utilitarian, of course.
Oh my, yeah.
But then it'll go from there.
But the conscious.
So yeah, it's one question. So I always like to think about the unintended consequences, right?
Mm-hmm.
So so when we create these things, anywhere have you guys read of any inventor, scientist, who, as he's creating something, he's also immediately thinking about the unintended consequences of his creation?
Yeah, that
scientists will.
Exists. Yeah, usually that happens pretty much right away.
But the reason I asked the question, though, Steve, I've never seen any technology provider who will tell you all the things that could go wrong with his technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there is the culture of, like, we talk about the fake it till you make it kind of Silicon Valley culture. And although right now, interestingly, we talked about AI, it's moving so fast that even people in the industry are like, we should slow down. We need an industry-wide slowdown, because otherwise we're like racing to keep up with each other in a kind of a reckless way. And I think there's also a lot of geneticists who are like, this is awesome. Like the CRISPR technology, the power that we have to control genetics is awesome. But the geneticists are saying we need to really think very carefully about applying this technology to the human germline, or really any germline of any species. So they are saying it. They are saying, like, when you get to that technology, like, holy crap, we could all be altering life at a fundamental level in a way that gets into the general population. We should not do this until we have really carefully thought about it.
Okay, well, look, we're going to wrap it up here pretty soon. Okay. I can see me getting some signals from my staff that we're going to...
You don't want to talk for a few more hours?
No, but I do want to, just for those listening, because I always want to find some practical applications, even of skepticism, right? Yeah. So just, I don't want you to answer the question. So should we trust futurists?
Yes and no. Right. So futurists, I think, are running very important, critical, really, thought experiments about how to project and how to think about the future. But if a futurist makes a detailed prediction, I wouldn't trust that. So we actually are careful to say, like in the book, even though we do make predictions, we're not really.
That's why I'm asking the question, because I want to read the book. I'm like, okay, so
but we really don't make predictions. It's more about, this is what could happen depending on the choices we make. It's more about possibilities.
Here's a utopian possibility. Here's a dystopian possibility, and anything in between. We try not to put our head, to put our dime down on one specifically. Sometimes we do, but for the big ones, it's like, here's the possibilities. I think a good futurist will do that.
And that's why I like it with the book, in that it's not necessarily a prescription. It's a guide that we all can use when we start thinking about it. Two other quick questions. Skepticism. So the book, The Skeptic's Guide to the Future. You're not denialist, but just raising skepticism. Should we teach people how to be skeptics?
Oh my God, absolutely.
Oh my God, yes.
Absolutely.
Only one person can answer, by the way. Whoever wants to.
One aspect that I think is very important with teaching scientific skepticism is how to evaluate evidence.
Yes.
A lot of people, I think, are horrible at determining what is good evidence, what is bad evidence. That kind of thinking has led people down the path of, like, I don't need to get vaccinated. It's like, because if you look at what their evidence is, it's probably not very good evidence, because that's what they considered evidence convinced them that they don't need to get vaccinated for COVID. And that decision, took lives. It's got a body count, that kind of thinking.
Well, listen, we're going to wrap up here. The book, The Skeptic's Guide to the Future, What Yesterday's Science and Science Fiction Tells Us About the World of Tomorrow. I was so happy when I found this book. I enjoyed reading it. It really opened my eyes to a lot of things. And so the closing, usually you have 30 seconds to wrap up here. I give you a 30-second warning now, so you'll be the last, Jay. So we'll start with you, Steve. What would be your, not a prediction, 2050? Give us a taste of the world in 2050.
So, I think in 2050, one of the trends that I think is going to really be accelerating by then is not only is the virtual world, the electronic world that we live in becoming more digital, the physical world that we're living in is going to become more digital. We're going to be increasingly connecting our digital world with physical reality. Like 3D printing, I think, is a perfect example of that, where you go directly from a digital design to a physical object. And that trend is just going to be continuing. And I think we may be getting close to an inflection point.
So digital twin, digital triplets, digital quadruples, whatever, right? Okay, what about you, Bob? What's your 2050?
2050, I would have to predict that artificial general intelligence and quantum computers will be transforming the world in ways that we can't possibly predict right now.
And then how about you, Jay?
I was going to talk about artificial intelligence, but I think the electrification is truly going to be a real thing by 2050. I think everybody will be driving electric vehicles. I think that, energy use by regular people is mostly going to be electric, and oil will be majorly on the way out.
And just for full disclosure, Jay and I didn't talk before he made that last comment about electrification. This wasn't a plan. So anyway, thank you all for joining us. Congratulations.
Our pleasure.
Please join me in thanking Jay and Bob and Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.